If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Brewing beer requires significant resources in the form of raw materials and energy. I've spent a number of episodes discussing upcycling brewers' spent grains, but what about spent hops? I'm your host, Cade Job, and today in the lab I'm speaking with Dean Hauser, who's currently a Ph.D. student at Cornell University, but he got his master's degree here at Oregon State University with Dr. Tom Shellhammer, where he researched upcycling spent hops for alternative applications in the brewhouse. Well, over the last decade or more, we've definitely seen a rise in hoppy beers, which derive a lot of their flavor from heavy dry hop additions, that is, adding hops during or towards the end of fermentation. And as brewers increase hop loads to get more hoppy flavor, there's an increase in spent material left in the bottom of the fermenter. So Dean asked, is there anything we can do with that material to reuse it in other areas of the brewhouse? So through some preliminary work, he had to understand what's left in the spent hops themselves. Are there alpha acids that might be used during the boil to create bitterness? Are there aromatic compounds that might allow for dry hops to be dry hopped again into other beers? And I don't want to spoil it, but there are lots of compounds left in spent hops that might be reused. So Dean explored one promising aspect, which is using the hops in the boil to add bitterness to beer. Well, it looks like I spoiled it after all. But the focus of today's episode is answering the question whether spent hops can be used in the boil as a bittering charge. So hops that were previously dry hopped, can you harvest those and then use them in the boil to bitter your beer? Does it work? How does it taste? Does it change any of the other chemical aspects of the beer like ABV, foam, etc.? Dean and I are going to try to answer these questions later in the show. Hey, have you clicked the button to become a patron yet? If not, please visit patreon.com/brewlosophy and consider helping us out. In addition to the feel-good vibes of helping to support the work we do here at Brewlosophy, you get access to a bunch of awesome rewards depending on the different pledge levels that you choose. You can get access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to monthly live Q&A sessions with a special guest from the brewing industry. So to me, this is the most underrated reward, the access to the Q&A sessions. Guests like John Palmer, Gordon Strong, Tom Shellhammer, and more are all saved on our private Patreon Facebook page. And there's a brand new guest each month. It's a huge treasure trove of information. If you want to up your brewing game, it's a no-brainer. All you have to do is become a patron by visiting patreon.com/brewlosophy. All right, earlier in the year, we got a nice bump in reviews from Apple Podcasts based on me and Marshall's request for reviews towards the end of the year. And I want to thank everyone that did that. And if you haven't already, please do so. It's a really easy way to help us out. People find this show by searching those reviews and searching for brewing-related podcast content. And the way that they find it is by you going out and leaving a rating or review if you're able to on the platform that you listen to. So also, I read every review, and I love hearing from you guys. I want to know that you're getting what you want out of the show, so please drop me a review or send me an email as feedback. And speaking of feedback, feedback this week is brought to you by the imaginative crew at Haas, who've developed a revolutionary way to dry hop using Spectrum, a flowable 100% hop-derived product that's fully dispersible in cold-side applications for great flavor, efficiency, and less beer loss. No solids means less loss, and it's fully dispersible in cold beer, so there's no contact or residency time required like traditional dry hopping. Spectrum fully disperses immediately, so you don't need to wait 24 to 48 hours or worry about double dry hopping, and you don't have to have any special dry hopping equipment. It stores easily, it's easy to use, saving you precious time and getting instant aroma in each batch. It's currently available to commercial brewers in trial quantities of Citra and Mosaic, so check it out by visiting johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. Also, you have just a few weeks left to sign up for the Hop Flavorist America course, which is offered by Haas in March in Yakima, Washington. It's a 3-day course taught by Brew Lab resident sensory scientist Jeff Daly, where you'll learn how to identify and describe the aromas of hops, where those aromas come from, and how to use them effectively. If you want more info, send Jeff an email at jeff.daily, that's D-A-I-L-E-Y, at johnihaas.com. All right, listener Martin wrote in with feedback about episode 94, Competitive Brewing with Jordan Folks. He says, he says, hello. Thank you for the episode on competitive brewing. It's very interesting and very impressive. In the episode, Jordan mentioned an article about Trappist Single from Michael Tonsmeyer. Is it possible to have the link to this article? And he says, also, I just listened to your episode on Koji malt. Super cool. That made me think of a brewery in France called Du Lion, I think I said that right, that makes beer without any malt, only raw grains, not just barley. I believe they're adding enzymes to make a mash without malt, but they don't share many details. Yet another possibility to produce our favorite beverage in a different way. Hey, Martin, thanks for the feedback and questions. So I've sent Martin the link to the Michael Tonsmeyer article about Trappist Singles, and if anyone else wants it, just shoot me an email, cade@brewlosophy.com, and I'll be happy to pass it on to you. Also, it's really cool to hear about Du Lion using raw grains. Enzymes are a really cool thing, and I'm planning to do an upcoming episode about using enzymes in brewing. And also, if you're interested in that kind of thing, check out episode 45, Brewing with Gluten-Free Grains, where I talked to JP Beerley of Beerley Brewing about using enzymes in gluten-free brewing. It's pretty cool stuff, and you probably like that episode as well. So thanks again, Martin, for your feedback and your questions. All right, I'll be back in a few minutes with Dean Hauser talking about reusing spent hops in the boil kettle. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. Dry hopping is an increasingly common technique used by brewers to increase pungent hoppy aromas in beer, especially in styles like American Pale Ales and IPAs. The dry hopping requires a high volume of hops, which means that there's a lot of material left over in the bottom of the fermenter after the beer is transferred away for conditioning and packaging. So with me in the lab today to talk about upcycling that spent hop material is Dean Hauser. He's current Ph.D. student at Cornell University and an alumnus of Dr. Tom Shellhammer at Oregon State University. So, Dean, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad that you're here. This is one of those studies that I'm surprised it took me so long to get you on the show. I remember whenever this research came out and everybody was talking about it, like, oh my gosh, we can reuse hops, and how can we reuse them? That's such a cool way to upcycle waste, and it's still widely discussed by brewers and scientists. I mean, it's kind of a tantalizing way to recover material and reuse it in the brew house, don't you think?
Yeah, it was a really exciting piece of research to be able to do. Glad that Tom let me kind of pursue it while I was there. So very excited to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's pretty cool, right? I mean, we'll get into the study here in just a minute, but I do want to talk about you first. So you are a PhD student at Cornell, and you got your master's in food science and technology at Oregon State with Dr. Tom Shellhammer, which is where you did this research at Oregon State. So this episode is about upcycling hops, but have you been able to continue similar research at Cornell?
Yeah. So fortunately, I've kind of been able to do upcycling research ever since I left Tom. So I was at Gallo for a period of time looking at grape pomace, and then working at Mondelez, I had a chance to work with the Upcycled Food Association and look at upcycled ingredients for products there. And yeah, at Cornell, I'm kind of taking a new look at upcycling. So I started with beer, then wine, and now I'm looking at dairy products. So
Wow.
the lab that I work with, working under Dr. Sam Alkane, we do a lot of research looking at adding value to waste streams from the dairy industry. So things like acid whey from yogurt making, whey permeate from cheese, milk permeate from those concentrated milk products that are becoming more popular, and seeing how we can use alternative yeast to ferment those into new beverages that could be kombucha-like and non-alcoholic, or also potentially hard seltzer kind of drinks.
Wow, interesting. Wow, using dairy waste to like turn it into kombucha or to maybe even hard seltzer alcoholic drink. That's pretty cool. That's fun research.
Yeah, no, it's a ton of fun.
Very
good to
cool.
be back in beverages.
I know, right? Yeah, yeah. It seems like maybe you know. Oh yeah, you did spend some time at Mondelez. I was about to say it didn't seem like you left with Gallo at the wineries, but I guess it's been fermentation related the whole way, or was Mondelez not fermentation?
No, not necessarily fermentation. A lot of what I was looking at there was related to sugar and calorie reduction. So looking for things that you could use to lower sugar in their products. And then there's also a strong component of looking at upcycled and sustainable ingredients, either for that purpose or just kind of holistically.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's cool though too. I mean, you're kind of developing a path for you for upcycling ingredients. And when I reached out to you, I actually reached out to you for a different study that you had done, which was the double dry hopping, or like when doing a single stage dry hopping or a 2-stage dry hopping. And you said, hey, I've actually got this other research project about like upcycling hops, and I was like, oh crap, I can't believe I forgot about that one. And so since that's been a particular focus of yours, that's what we're going to talk about today, is that upcycling of those spent hops. But I do want to get you back at some point to talk about single versus double dry hopping. So I'm going to tease that a little bit right here, and put you on air on the hook to come back and talk about that. So let's talk about this study then. So why don't you give us sort of like a quick overview? Like, what's the sort of abstract level of this study that you were looking for?
Yeah. So we noticed that as craft beer has become more and more popular, and hoppy beers in particular have become more and more popular over the past, I guess now it's like 20 years, 15, 20 years. Yeah. Brewers are using more and more hops, especially dry hops, in order to get those new exciting aromas, those fruity smells. And when you're doing that, we had questions about how efficiently you're extracting the aroma compounds that you're actually looking for, and then also what else might be left behind, because there are things beyond aroma. In hops, all hops have alpha acids, which contribute to bitterness in beer. So we kind of had the idea of first a study that preceded this, looking at what's left behind in that material, which I think we'll talk a little bit about later as well. And then how can you reuse it? So this study covered the how can you reuse it part. So we did some small scale reuse trials that didn't involve sensory, just looking at the chemistry. Then we did some larger scale brews, and did some sensory and consumer sensory on those as well.
Yeah, cool. So this is going to be a lot of fun, right? I mean, and then there is kind of two pieces of that, and that's kind of where we'll start on the first half of the show, is that prior research that you did, right? Like, it's like, what is left behind? We need to understand like what's left behind. So we'll talk briefly sort of about that, and then how can we reuse hops, and can we? And then of course the study that we're talking about here is to put it into application. So like you said, you did some lab scale, and then some pilot scale brews looking at chemistry, and then sensory components. So I always do like to do a tease as well. So are there any big takeaways from the study that we can share, like right at the top?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's a lot of value left behind in spent dry hops, and you can extract that value. So you can reuse them. There are obviously some challenges related to that I think we're going to get into later, but it is possible. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. See, I mean, I've done a number of episodes on sustainability, and this is again a cool one. I mean, we talk about a lot, like, you know, brewers' spent grains, right? And I think that gets a lot of attention because it's a really obvious one and a really easy one for brewers, right? I mean, there's so much volume that's coming out of those spent grains. It's like, what do we do with all this? And every brewer has their own specific use that they're putting their spent grains to. But let's talk about spent hops. And as I say, so first of all, so why do this research? Why would we even want to reuse hops?
Yeah, I think the sustainability point that you mentioned earlier, there was a small technical quarterly that I wrote when I was working for Time, just looking at the sustainability impacts of beer as a whole, and then kind of a specific focus looking at hops. And like you mentioned, brewer spent grain gets a lot more attention than hops generally because it is, in most cases, taking up more of the overall impact that's coming from the beer. But when you do look at much hoppier beers, so where the hop charge is in the range of several pounds per barrel, or if there are Europeans, that's like a pound per barrel. I think that's like a number that's burned in my brain. I think it's 3.86 grams per liter is 1 pound per barrel. So yeah, when you're getting up in those ranges, it kind of starts to shift the balance. It's unlikely that hops will have more of an impact than brewer spent grain in any barley-based beer, but they can get pretty close. So as we're using more and more, there's a bigger impact, and also it's just an easy way to try to get more value, especially when, from an economic perspective, if you're paying a lot of money for these really unique hops, just trying to get everything that you can out of them. And so that was kind of the big theme of my research at Oregon State. You mentioned that other double dry hopping paper, but I think my thesis title was just like looking at strategies to better utilize dry hops. So kind of trying to think of everything we can do to get the most out of them.
Yeah, that's a great comment, right? Like trying to get the most out of the ingredient, right? I mean, and you've got so many hops, and that's always one of those things that I think is hilarious too. It's like, think about like Citra hop, for example, right? Citra is super prized for its aroma. It's used in whirlpool and dry hopping very often, but Citra has a huge amount of alpha acids, or not necessarily, I mean, relatively, right? I think it's somewhere like 13 to 15% or something like that in alpha acids. So that's a lot of alpha acids that's just in Citra, right? And alpha acids aren't necessarily very soluble in wort. So it kind of makes sense that, like, hey, we're dumping all of the Citra in. What's happening to all those alpha acids? We know there's a little bit of bitterness. We see that. And I can't remember. I would think it was one of your contemporaries that did the research. Was it Scott, or maybe, I can't remember. It was one of Tom's other graduate students that did the research, saying that, like, hey, it's not just isomerized alpha acids that are contributing to bitterness. It's other things like oxidized or even alpha acids and beta acids themselves have some bitterness. But digress. Back to what we're talking about. It seems to me like very obvious, like when you think about it, crap, yeah, there's got to be a lot that's left over in those grains with a hop like Citra that's got a high alpha acid, something like that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And we looked at that specifically in that study that I mentioned. But those were, I mean, it's obviously, and I'm sure you get this a lot interviewing scientists on your podcast, but it's always kind of like depends on the situation. So it's like, in this case, this happened. In that case, something else might happen. But in that first study that you had mentioned, where we kind of just looked at the extraction efficiency during dry hopping, we were looking at whole cone hops. And in terms of the alpha acid that was left behind, we were seeing kind of a very low point of around 60% all the way up to like almost 100% of the alpha acids being left behind. And
wow,
there were some difficulties in measuring that, and we had to make some adjustments based on the amount of solids that were leaving the hops as well. But I think the big takeaway is that, like, roughly, maybe you could say safely 2/3 or so of the alpha acids are being left behind in that material that most people are discharging with other waste materials. Like, people will give it in totes to farmers to apply to fields. Some people will just throw it away. So there's definitely a lot that you can do with it that isn't necessarily being done.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's just going down the drain, right? I mean, a lot of breweries are just dumping that hop and yeast material, the trub that's down at the bottom of the fermenter. They're just dumping it right down the drain if they're allowed to. I mean, a lot of municipalities are starting to crack down on that kind of stuff these days. But like you said, going out to farmers and stuff. And so this study, so we want to spend just a little bit of time talking about that study. I'll give you the title first. It's called "The Extraction Efficiency of Dry Hopping," and that was published in the Journal of the American Society of Brewing Chemists in May of 2019. And again, the cool takeaway from that was, as you saw, like around, kind of conservatively safely, 2/3 of the unisomerized alpha acids are just left behind in the spent hops. And that's pretty cool, right? I mean, so that at least sort of suggests the idea maybe that spent hops might be able to be used, to recover that alpha acid, right? I mean, maybe like in the boil?
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into the paper that we're talking about. That is, yeah, so that's where we went from there, is how we know that they're there, what happens if we reuse them. And there's a term that we'll talk about a bit later called utilization, but that's specifically what we were looking at for reusing these. And of course, the 2/3 was in whole cone hops, so it might be a little bit lower when you have smaller particles like in pelletized hops. But again, it's kind of a case by case thing. But the main takeaway is that there's something there, and I think it's definitely a good idea to try to use it for the reasons that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And so there was another piece of that former study too that I wanted to talk about, just real briefly. It's not necessarily germane to our topic, but one of the things we got to think about is like, okay, well, yeah, bitterness is left there, but what about like other hop oils and stuff? Are there aromatic compounds that are retained in hops? And you looked into that as well in that previous study.
Yeah, so we did look at that as well. There was definitely less oil retained if you're looking at total oil. So by that ASBC steam distillation method, just the total volume, we were seeing on average up to almost 50% of the oil being retained in the hop material. And of course, it's a little bit more complicated there, because when you're looking at alpha acids, you're only looking at a few compounds, and when you're looking at oil, you're looking at potentially hundreds of compounds. And the correlation, like you said, in beer, it's not necessarily 1-to-1 isoalpha acid to bitterness. But when you're looking at oils and aroma, it gets a lot more complicated in terms of how different compounds are interacting to create different aromas. So getting an idea more specifically what's important in that oil that's left behind as well.
Yeah, and y'all looked into that a little bit, right? To see kind of like what compounds, generally are more left behind than other compounds. And there was a pretty interesting takeaway from that, right?
Yeah, so we did look at a number of different compounds that we've looked at in the past in the lab. So a lot of terpenes, like monoterpene alcohols like linalool and geraniol, that kind of a lot of the hop flavor chemistry research has shown to be important to beer flavor and aroma over the years. I think Scott worked on a paper looking at geraniol specifically and how that contributes to hop aroma as opposed to measuring total oil. So kind of looking at critical markers that you might be able to use. And we did see kind of that the oil after the extraction was enriched in larger and less polar compounds. So unfortunately, a lot of the smaller compounds that we think are more associated with hop aroma were depleted. And a lot of the larger ones that are kind of more like myrcene and larger sesquiterpenes, if you're going out in that direction, were kind of enriched in the hop oil. And that also makes sense. There was a paper, forgot exactly who was by it. You can look at the reference in that paper that you just mentioned, the extraction efficiency paper. But we also did a plot of looking at the extraction and retention rates of different hop volatiles and plotted that against the log of the octanol water partition coefficient. And so that was an idea that we got from another paper. Again, you can find it cited in my paper. Want to give them credit for having the idea. But octanol water partition coefficient is kind of just an idea of how polar or non-polar a compound is. So it looks at if a compound is more likely to partition into octanol, which is an organic solvent, or water, which is water. Most people are familiar with it. Yeah. And you can see that as the partition coefficient goes up, meaning things are more likely to partition into octanol, there was a lot more retention of those compounds and also a lot less extraction of them. So kind of as things are getting less polar, they're more likely to be left behind in that material, which definitely would have impacts if you're looking at dry hopping with these dry hops for aroma, although we haven't had a chance to look into that yet.
Right. If you're trying to dry hop with the spent hops, that might cause some issues. And that's a really, really cool point, right? A really key takeaway here is that so these like you said, the non-polar compounds like hydrocarbons, like myrcene and these long sesquiterpenes those are staying in the spent hops. They're retained in the spent hops because they're not getting extracted into the beer. So it's kind of like you said, it's kind of like it depends on which frame of reference you're looking at, right? Because it's kind of like, hey, these oxygenated compounds like linalool and geraniol are compounds that we want in beer, and they're going into the beer, from dry hop charges. But if you're looking at reusing the spent hops, there's not as many of those oxygenated compounds. You're stuck with these, not stuck, but you've got a lot of these other compounds like myrcene, and that one's kind of known for being like sort of grassy and spicy, right? And maybe not having these fruity characteristics that the other like geraniol and linalool have, so it's interesting to think about. So you got sort of two big takeaways from this prior study, right? This extraction efficiency paper. One is that there's, 2/3 of the alpha acids are retained in spent hops, and there's still a lot of hop oils that are retained, although it's not necessarily like those, fruity and oxygenated compounds that a lot of brewers are seeking. So, hey, maybe not the best to dry hop with these hops, but maybe a good way to reuse them would be in the boil, for bitterness, sort of, right? Is that kind of like where you guys are leaning after this first study?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great segue to the next study. But yeah, I think it would certainly be interesting to look at re-dry hopping with spent dry hops.
Yeah.
But I think the bitterness angle is probably more effective, and also it's a lot easier to measure as well. So I think it's just kind of the higher impact, lower hanging fruit that we wanted to go after. And there's still potential to look at reusing the spent dry hops for additional dry hopping, but didn't have a chance to do that while I was in Oregon.
Yeah. Well, let's then segue into the current study that you were looking at, right? And we'll talk a little bit about the background for that. And so one of the things was that you wanted that you mentioned earlier is that breweries are using potentially huge amounts of hops, right? Like I think in the paper you said some breweries are using 5 to 6 pounds per barrel of hops, and I've heard of that. I mean, I know that's true. 5 to 6 pounds per barrel of hops is like 20 grams per liter for the Europeans and everyone else in the world, who's not using the imperial system. But for homebrewers also, that's like 10 ounces in a 5-gallon batch of beer. That's a crap load of hops, right? And so that's a huge amount of spent material. And if you've got 2/3 of the remaining bitterness in there, that's a lot of opportunity to reuse those hops in the boil. So let's talk about reusing hops in the boil. And I guess the first sort of highest level question we have to answer is, why do we even put hops in the boil? What happens to hops in the boil?
Yeah, so that's getting back to that word that I mentioned earlier, utilization. And there's been a ton of research on this. If you look in the literature in terms of like what impacts it, what makes it better, what makes it worse. But it's basically a measure of if you're putting in X grams of alpha acids with your hops, how many of them are getting isomerized into their respective iso alpha acids. And the importance of that is that the alpha acids are not as soluble in beer and also not as bitter as the iso alpha acids. So I think that paper that you mentioned earlier, where I think it was Christina Hahn, and then Scott followed up on that, looking at kind of what chemistry components of the beer impact the bitterness. There maybe is a contribution from alpha acids, but you don't really find them in huge quantities in beer. If I remember correctly, it's kind of in like the 0 to 10 ppm level. And again, they are much less bitter, but their isomerized counterparts are much more associated with beer bitterness. So those are kind of what, back before that paper that Christina did, and then Scott followed up on it. Back before that, the conventional thinking was that 1 BU or bitterness unit, or IBU, internet, whatever you want to call it, is about 1 part per million of iso alpha acid. So that's kind of the key contributor to beer bitterness there. And utilization is just looking at how effectively can you turn A into B.
Yeah, and so utilization is a really important component for brewers, right? Because if you're thinking about reusing your spent hops, you want to know how much of those alpha acids, if I'm adding a whole bunch of alpha acids, how much of those are actually going to get isomerized and turn into bitterness, right? And so utilization's always pretty low. I mean, even if you're starting with like normal hop pellets or normal whole cones, utilization's, I don't know, I think it's like, if I remember from your paper, Dean, it's like down in like the low, maybe upper 20s, low 30s generally with normal pellets?
Yeah, I think that's a safe range. And yeah, depending on what product you're looking at, you can get like maybe 20 to 40% utilization. And that's also why there are companies that sell like those ISO extracts where you can just dose them exactly. So in order to get, you want to get the most out of your hops, and you're not often getting it, but especially when you're trying to reuse a new material, it's important.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's an important part of this research, right? Is like figuring out how much is utilized. So let's say, so we've got 2/3 of our alpha acids that are left in the spent hops. How much of those alpha acids then actually go into the beer if we use them in the boil? Because, I mean, again, you want to look at this and say like, okay, if we're using normal pellets and I'm expecting like, let's say 30, just as a round number, 30% utilization. But if I'm using spent hops and I'm only getting 10 or 15%, then it's like, okay, well, I don't really want to mess with the spent hops and all that. But if you're getting similar utilization as you would pellets, that's pretty useful, right? Because then okay, I can use these spent hops to get bitterness, in my beers in a relatively efficient way, right? Or in at least a similar way to the pellets, I guess, right? That's sort of like the theory or a guess, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what we were most interested in, is trying to make it practical to reuse these. And I guess there is a question of whether it is that practical. That'll come up, I think, as we keep talking. But yeah, that was the main goal. So we looked at it, like I mentioned before, just on like a lab bench scale, pilot brew, and then also try to look at what the sensory differences might be there. But yeah, I think that's the most important number, because if you have a beer with a specific bitterness level that you're trying to hit, it's pretty important to get there and to be able to know how much of the hop material you need to get there.
Yeah, exactly. How much of the hop material you need to get there. And then another question I had, which we can talk about real quick, is like what else is in it too, right? And so I had sort of a functional question about like what else is going into the boil with the spent hops, right? Like there's going to be some practical difficulties of getting like pure spent hops out of the fermenter, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff in the fermenter, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So depending on your dry hopping system, some people will, or I guess that maybe this is like totally uncommon for people to totally remove yeast before dry hopping, but a lot of people will at least like kind of passively remove it, like blow off the yeast cone from the bottom and then add dry hops. But obviously you're going to have some beer that the hops soak up. So there's going to be some beer. So whatever that beer that you dry hopped is going to be being added to your boil, whether for better or for worse. And I think one of the other things is, like you mentioned, if there's any trub left over from the brew, and then especially whatever yeast you have floating around. So if you're boiling yeast, that could add something as well to what you're measuring, whether that's like phenolic compounds or whatever the yeast are holding on to. But yeah, that does make it a challenge. Also, the other challenge is that this is wet, whereas like hop pellets that you buy are dry and ready to go. So the storage is a question. Collecting them is a question. Trying to maintain consistency between different batches is also a question. So there are a lot of question marks that you need to kind of address if you do want to integrate this into your brewing system. Right.
And so a lot of answering those question marks, maybe not all of them, but trying to answer as many as you can, was sort of the purpose of this study, right? And so again, you're trying to look at, if we're talking about like an overarching goal of the study, it's how can we reuse spent hops, but specifically since we see this, high alpha acid concentration, can we use spent hops as bittering charges? Is this like a plausible method for getting bitterness into beer? And I love the sensory piece of this. And one of the reasons why I wanted to ask that question about what else goes into the boil, right, is like you mentioned, if you're boiling yeast, that may contribute some off sensory flavors, right, that you wouldn't want, in your beer. So if you're reusing these spent hops, who knows what sort of sensory impact it's going to have in addition to just bitterness, right? It might have like some aromatic differences. And so that's what I really appreciate whenever I see sensory analysis of this too. It's like we can measure the compounds and, like you said, measure directly how much alpha acids went in, how much isomerized alpha acids came out, and then we know that the beer is going to be, sort of bitter, and we can correlate that to BUs and stuff. But until you actually serve it to someone and have them do some sensory analysis on it, we don't know what it's actually going to taste like, right? It could taste terrible, or it could taste just like a normal beer, and then that would be awesome. That would be the great takeaway, because then you can reuse spent hops without impacting your beer, your brand.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is kind of what stands in the way. We did do some sensory analysis. We didn't do descriptive analysis, so we don't know kind of the fine details of the differences in different aromas and flavors in the beer. We did some discrimination testing to just look at, can people tell the two beers that we ended up making, or four beers that we ended up making apart. And then we did also some consumer testing, but that was specifically liking. So kind of just looking at, can people tell the difference? And there's some reasons why in this case, we expected them to be able to tell the difference. Although if the beers were a little bit more similar, maybe people wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And then we also looked at liking. So aroma liking, overall liking, and bitterness liking. And the goal of that is this an acceptable product? Like, is there something terribly wrong with it? Like if you use spent hops and you drink it and it just tastes awful for some reason, one of those components that you're bringing in is just contributing something that makes it totally unacceptable. So we wanted to kind of get at that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think that's a great spot for us to take a break. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll take a break. We'll come back and look at the results to see whether spent hops can be used as a bittering addition to make beer more bitter.
Established in 1995, More Beer has been consistently serving the greater brewing community since the times IPA was expected to be bitter and clear, and there are reasons they've stuck around so long. In addition to their massive product selection and excellent customer service, More Beer has locations on both the west and the east coast of the United States, which translates into fast shipping times regardless of where you live. And when you spend more than $59, shipping is free. When you're in need of brewing ingredients and gear, there's no better option than morebeer.com, one of the most trusted shops on the planet.
Hops are a prized ingredient in beer, and when boiled, they contribute a bitterness that offsets the sweetness from the malt and alcohol. When added during or after fermentation, through a process known as dry hopping, they contribute delectable aromas. And Dean, as I understand it, dry hopping has been performed for hundreds of years, but it does seem like recently it's exploded.
Yeah, definitely. I think like we were talking about before, with people liking craft beer more in general, and hoppier beers being more and more popular, dry hopping is kind of the key lever that brewers are pulling in order to get more of that hop aroma. So all those funky, fruity smells that people are after, especially in newer beer styles like the East Coast, like the hazy IPAs, and also West Coast IPAs. So it's definitely something that's more recently become more of a characteristic of popular beer. Although, like you mentioned, it's been done for a really long time. So I think like India Pale Ales, they would add extra hops because hops have preservative properties. So when they were shipping it from the UK to India, they needed something to keep it stable. But now it's kind of just, let's try to get as much aroma as we possibly can.
Right? The American way. Let's get as much hops as we can. Let's go as big as we can, and throw as many hops. Let's throw 20 grams per liter of hops into there and into the beer and see what we can get. But you're right. And so it has exploded. There's a lot more use now, especially in styles like hazy IPAs and even in West Coast IPAs. And that's created this big waste stream that's spent hops, right? Or trub in the bottom of the fermenter. And so this is cool. So again, your research is looking at upcycling those spent hops. So let's talk through the methods and then we'll get into the results. The first thing I want to ask is, where did you get your spent hops for this study?
Yeah, so we worked with a local brewery out in Oregon, out in Corvallis. We wanted to be able to use something that was coming from a commercial setting. So that's what we did. And we collected hops from them over a pretty long period of time. I had started collecting it to get some data that, can't remember if we included it in that first extraction efficiency paper that I mentioned, but kind of wanted to see like what's left in a material where they're using pelletized hops and it's a like small-ish, I guess small medium. Well, I don't know what the technical definitions are, but it's definitely a bigger brewery than the pilot brewery at Oregon State University. So we wanted to see what's happening in that system, and then also like batch to batch, how much variation is there in terms of the alpha acids that are left behind?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely some economy or some scale issues, right? I mean, if you're talking about lab scale versus, or dry hopping on a lab scale versus dry hopping in a commercial brewery, there's different factors that are gonna impact it, about like extraction and stuff. And so that's interesting. So you used a local brewery to collect your spent hops as, kind of the best, proof of concept of like, this is what hops would look like if brewers started reusing spent hops. Do we need to know the starting beer specifications? Would that in any way impact the extraction of the compounds or anything that you wanted to study, or does that matter at all?
I think it's not something that I've really thought about before, but I think it could definitely play a role. There's obviously the potential for dissolved alpha acids or isoalpha acids, making it from the first beer that the spent hops are coming from into the next beer, although it's not super likely, and it'd probably be at relatively low levels because you're looking at it in the beer, not in the hop material. But yeah, I certainly think that there could be effects in terms of like maybe the alcohol content affecting how well things are being extracted from the hops, or potentially whatever matrix, so whatever beer the hops are in originally, there could certainly be an effect of that as like a pre-treatment that could impact utilization. Because of course, like no one I think has really studied utilization of spent hop material. I know there's one study that I cited in the paper that we're talking about, where they looked at like extracts in combination with spent hop material, and I believe they saw higher utilization there. So I think there's a lot that you could potentially look into. It's just a question of like what's worth looking into and what's practical.
Yeah, for sure, right? I mean, it would take a whole separate study to see if the starting beer impacts what is extracted in the spent hops. So then I guess I need to ask then, do you know what style of beer was brewed in the original hop? For the original hops, was it I'm assuming it was an IPA or something along those lines.
Yeah, I believe it was actually a double IPA. So I think it was about 8% alcohol, and they dry hopped with a mix of, I think, 3 or 4 different varieties at almost 5 pounds per barrel. So it was a big boozy hoppy beer that this was coming from.
I see, and so that's where the hops were coming out of. So how were the hops then collected? How were they actually drawn out of the fermenter?
Yeah, so at this brewery, they would blow off most of the yeast, and then I believe they would cool the beer and then do the dry hopping. So there was kind of a cone of dry hops mixed with a little bit of yeast hanging out at the bottom of the fermenter. So they basically just drained that for me, and then I would take it back to the lab and somewhat unscientifically try to dewater a little bit. So I'd kind of just put it in these like mesh bags and wring it out as best I could to get the water, the moisture content down a little bit, just to make them a little bit easier to handle, and then freeze them immediately.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So and I'm guessing this brewery was they were doing, like you mentioned earlier, like they're harvesting their yeast before they're adding dry hops and at least blowing out the yeast cone. So there's not like a huge amount of like, dead yeast or fresh yeast cells in those spent hops.
Yeah, ideally no. I'm sure there was some, but again, it's tough to do perfectly when you're working with a practical larger scale brewery. I don't know if there are a lot. There may be some people who filter or centrifuge their beer between fermentation and dry hopping, but not a lot of people probably.
Yeah. Probably not a whole lot of people. And I just looked it up. It looks like it was Centennial, Cascade, and Amarillo hops that were mixed together. So yeah, cool. There we go. Awesome. So you're like squeezing. I feel bad for you having to like squeeze the liquid out of these hops, but that's important, right? Because then you're just adding a whole bunch of extra liquid. If you're going into the boil, pellets don't have any liquid. I mean, there's probably some moisture content, but they're not like a slurry of hops and liquid that you're like dumping into into your kettle. So you are having to like squeeze out all of that extra stuff. Do you think, this is just total speculation, and I know you haven't done any research on this, but like if I were a brewer and I were just looking for an easy way to get that stuff back into my kettle. Would you have to squeeze out all the liquid to it, or could you just like dump the slurry into your boil kettle?
I don't think so. No, I think you could just dump the slurry back. I was just doing it for the sake of having less material to handle and trying to have like a more consistent material. Of course, there are challenges with just adding it back to the kettle, because I think one of the key things that makes this difficult to do is that you need to know exactly what is left behind in that material, and you would need to know the concentration. So if you have one batch of spent hops that are 1% of not one like the number, like a specific percent by weight alpha acid and a specific percent moisture, knowing that while you're pumping it into the kettle isn't really possible. So if you want to be really exact, it becomes kind of difficult.
Right. So being exact for like scientific purposes, but also being exact for consistency.
Yeah.
Right.
For brand purposes.
Yeah. For brewing, for brand purposes, to make sure that you're actually getting the right bitterness in there. So, but I guess you might be able to like, I'm totally just like spitballing here. We're off into the weeds a little bit, but I guess you could like, pump it off into a tote and then have that tote measured, for like, whatever hop material or something is in it, and then use that to then run back into the boil kettle, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think that material holding could happen. I guess then there's like a question, like when you're looking at sustainability of different systems, there's always the question of, okay, now you have to collect it and refrigerate it, and what are the energy impacts of that? And it always gets difficult when you're looking at sustainability of systems that involve upcycling, because you want to take that material and do something else with it to improve the sustainability of the system. But if you're doing maybe too many things to it, then it starts to get unclear, like what is it better to just let it go to waste? Is it better to do something with it? And then obviously begs the question of like, what is better? What use is better? And it gets really complicated. And there's a lot of decisions that you have to make about different impacts that are happening. But
yeah, that's
a whole nother story. Yeah.
Right. A whole nother story. That's a good, there was an example that I was talking about with somebody the other day. It was like that burning brewer spent grains. So apparently there's a lot of people that actually burn their brewer spent grains to fire their kettles in ways. And it's like, if you think about it, like spent grains have a huge amount of moisture in it. So they have to be dried, or you have to, essentially burn off all of that moisture. So like how much extra energy is going to burn off all that moisture? But again, we digress. We're talking about spent hops here, not brewer spent grains. Okay, so we've got our spent grains coming out of an our spent hops coming out of an Imperial IPA. It was a mixture of hops, which I like and appreciate, for this, because it's not just like one hop, so you're not limited to like, okay, yeah, we just used Cascade, so these impacts are only, attributable to Cascade. It's nice because it's a mixture. You've got a range of hops in there, and they're collected out of the fermenter and then dewatered, right, by like you physically squeezing it. But I'm sure there are other procedures for dewatering if people wanted to do that. And then I guess the last thing I need to know is like, what was the hopping rate of that original beer, so we can kind of understand, like how many hops were actually put into the original fermenter, right? Like what's the quantity of hops that we're then going to be able to use spent hops? If I remember correctly, I think it was something huge, like 4 pounds per barrel or something crazy like that. Crazy.
Yeah, I'm looking through now. I believe it was between 4 and 5 pounds per barrel.
Yeah, something. Here it is. I see it. It's 16 grams per, 15.92 grams per liter, or 4.125 pounds per barrel. So there we go.
Yeah, between 4 and 5. Yeah, sorry, it's been it's been 4 years since I left Tom's lab.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy to think about it. I know. And again, like I can't believe I haven't gotten you on the. Oh yeah, and here's the descriptions of the beer: Imperial India Pale Ale, alcohol content of 8.4%, starting gravity of 17.3, final gravity 17.3 degrees Plato, final gravity of 4.9 degrees Plato, pH of 4.76. And around 80 bitterness units in the beer, in the hops, or in the boil. So there we go. There's the starting. And here's the hops. I mispronounced it. Citra, Amarillo, Centennial, Mosaic, and Columbus is the mixture of hops. 5 varieties. So cool.
Yep.
There we go. All right, now we've got everything set up. All right, so we've got a huge dry hop load going into this beer. We're collecting our spent dry hops, and now we're going to put them through your trials. And so the first thing that you did was a lab scale fermentation. So why don't you talk to us about like what you did in that lab scale fermentation?
Yeah, and before that, I'll just mention, as I was looking around trying to find the information that you're looking for, I did also see or kind of remember that while there is, like we were talking about, potential variation in that waste stream in terms of the alpha acids, when we collected it for this study, we looked at it three separate collections. So 2 of them were used for the pilot scale, or sorry, the lab scale trials, and 1 was used for the actual brewing trial. And the differences in terms of percent weight were less than 0.1% in terms of alpha acid. So,
wow. Okay,
so
yeah.
I mean, that might just be luck that there was consistency there, but it seems like in a system where there's a lot of consistency in how things are being done, there isn't a ton of variation in the alpha acid content. But anyway, so yeah, before we went and did it in the brew house at Oregon State, we wanted to look on a smaller scale. So if anyone's done, I guess you've probably done this, the hydrodistillation for oil, we just use those round bottom flasks and the mantles there with a distillation trap to add hops and look at a utilization trial there. So basically 1.5 liters of a wort that we diverted from a different brew that was going on, add the hops at the same rate, looking at alpha acids, in terms of alpha acids, adding the hop pellets and the dry hops, and then just, I think we did a 1 hour boil there and then measured alpha acids going in and isoalpha acids coming out to calculate that utilization number.
Yeah, and that's an important part of this too, right? Is you calculated the alpha acids going in like normal pellets and in the spent hop slurry, and then you tried to make that the same, right? Whenever you add it in there. So that actually is going to, if I remember from your paper, that's actually going to change the amount of hop material that you add into the boil, right? Because if the spent hop material has 66% less alpha acids, you're going to have to use, or I'm sorry, not 66%. It's got 66% of the normal pellets. You're going to have to use more of the spent hop slurry in order to get the same alpha acid level in the beer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because it's much more dilute. So I think even like for example, in the pilot scale brew, and this was probably a similar ratio in the smaller brews, but we had like 116 grams of hop pellets, and then for the spent dry hops, we had 490 grams.
Whoa.
So
yeah.
Quite a bit more. Yeah.
Yeah. Quite a bit more material in there. But again, the key here is that you're trying to match that alpha acid concentration because you want to measure utilization. You want to know how much of that alpha acid is actually turned into, isomerized alpha acids. So let's talk about results from the lab scale real quick. So if I'm looking at, well, why don't you take us through the results for the lab scale and we'll see what we get.
Yeah. So on the lab scale with the hop pellets, we ended up adding about 2.2 grams in the 1.5 liter trials and about 11 grams of spent hops. The isoalpha acids in the final wort ended up being, respectively for the pellets and the spent hops, about 44 and 60 parts per million. So maybe somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 BUs. And then if you actually look at the amount of alpha acid that was added and the amount of iso that came out, the utilization rates on average were 28.7 and 28.8. So very similar utilization rates in that system.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a couple of big takeaways there. One is like just the volume of hop material was totally different, right? Normal hop pellets, 2.2 grams, and then the spent hops, 11.4 grams. That's almost 6 times as much material going in from the spent hops. So that's something to take into consideration. But the spent hops actually had a little bit more isoalpha acids get into the boil, even though they had similar utilization rates, right? And that's probably just because of the amount of alpha acid that was added by the hop material, right?
Yeah. So the conversion was similar, but the actual final isoalpha acids were a little bit different.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, I guess that's the nice thing about doing a utilization trial is you don't have to necessarily target the exact same, or I mean, we tried to obviously target the exact same final iso level, but when you're brewing a beer and you want it to be a certain bitterness at the end, you have to get those numbers exactly. But if you're looking at a unit like utilization where it's just a ratio of two numbers, then you can get, if you start with more alpha and you end with more ISO, you can get the same utilization as if you start with less and end with less. And that could also be what's later on we saw something different. So I mean, there are likely differences, and again, I guess it comes back to like system dependent. So in this case, we're just kind of boiling things in a round bottom flask. There's not like a ton of agitation. There's no recirculation that you might use in a commercial brew house, or even when you're using like a Brewzilla or something. So that definitely has an impact there. And then I'd also just add that, there is a lot more material in the spent dry hops, but there's also moisture there. So
yeah,
that's a big component of the material.
You're right. Yeah, moisture's a big component. So kind of the key takeaway from this then is you can expect similar utilization from spent hops and as normal pellets.
Yes, that's what we saw. Yeah, that's what we saw on the lab scale, certainly.
Okay, cool. And so then you take it up to like pilot scale. So that's in the OSU brew house. And why don't you take us through those trials and then your brewing trials?
Yeah, so it was very similar, but we kind of just scaled it up where we were looking at, I believe it was just a standard kind of Northwest Pale Ale, like what our lab uses for a lot of different trials of different hops.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a pale ale base, and we did one mash and then split it into two different worts to boil, and dose one with the hop pellets and dose one with the spent dry hops. Those additions ended up being, I think, like I mentioned before, about 100 versus about 500 grams of the pellets versus the spent material, respectively. And then I also included how much alpha acid was actually dosed. So in the pellets, it was about 90 milligrams per liter that were dosed. And then in the spent hops, it was about 98. And then we ended up with about 20 milligrams per liter of ISO in the wort that was hopped with the hop pellets, and about 26 or 27 with the spent hops. So in that case, we did see a higher utilization with the spent hops, coming in at about 27% versus 21% with the hop pellets.
Yeah, interesting. So this is cool, right? Because you are adding a whole bunch more material, right? 100 versus 500, but the utilization was still higher, right? Like, so the calculated alpha acid addition was pretty similar, but you got more iso alpha acids out of the spent dry hops. That's kind of fun. Is there any explanation for that, or any thought why that might be?
Yeah, I mean, there's that study that I mentioned with looking at like the spent material and how that somehow helped the extract get isomerized faster. I think there's definitely a possibility that since it was already like a wetted material, maybe there was more access, like there was more soluble at the time when the isomerization was happening.
Yeah.
That's all totally speculation though. But yeah, I mean, there are obviously a lot of factors that could come into play. Our brewing system has a lot of extra agitation that the lab scale system didn't. So maybe there were like slight differences that we didn't pick up on the lab scale, and then those were kind of amplified when we scaled up. But it's definitely an interesting thing and something that would be interesting to look into further.
Yeah, maybe like access to alpha acids. That one makes a lot of sense to me, right? If the alpha acids are more accessible in the spent dry hops because it's already in a liquid slurry versus like pellets that have to be broken up and scattered throughout the boil and all that sort of stuff. So yeah. All right. Well, okay. So that's sort of the chemistry piece of it. But then you had some other questions about like, well, what happens to the beer itself, right? Are there going to be changes in like fermentation performance, or a foam as another one that you measured? Were there any differences in the beers that were produced from those worts in terms of like, general beer quality metrics?
Yeah. So we looked at a number of things, and I'll just run through them, but I guess, or I'll thank him at the end. But yeah, so original extract, we were looking at in terms of degrees Plato, for all these, I'll say the pellet brew before the spent hop brew. So about 13.42 versus 13.48, alcohol 5.87 versus 5.9, residual extract the same at 4.8. Bitterness units, obviously a bit higher in the spent hop since we saw that higher utilization at almost the same alpha acid dosage. ISO also a little bit higher, correlating with those bitterness units. Total polyphenols, 214 versus 217 ppm. And then foam index about the same at 291 versus 287. So except for the bitterness compounds, the beers were very, very similar. And I have to thank the great brewery manager over at Oregon State, Jeff Clausen. He really knows exactly what he's doing. So definitely leaned on him pretty heavily for these trials, and it turned out nicely. So that's great.
Yeah, Jeff is awesome. He's a fantastic resource here at Oregon State and an incredible brewer too. I'm amazed, honestly, that we can always hit like exact numbers. He's got that system dialed in so well. But anyway, yeah, I mean, so again, big takeaway here is like the extract, original extract, residual extract, alcohol, foam, polyphenols, all of those things are virtually identical. I mean, they're very close. They're not the same, but they're very close to each other. The only one that's different is that bitterness component, which we noticed was because you got higher utilization out of the spent hops than the normal hop pellets. So some difference in bitterness there. And then this is where we enter, sort of, again, one of my favorite pieces of the analysis is the sensory. Okay, so you did a number of sensory tests to see whether or not these two beers actually taste different, and a little bit, in what way they taste different. So one of the things you mentioned was you did some discrimination testing between the two beers, and discrimination testing is kind of what like we do at Brewlosophy, which is triangle test, which is the 3 cups in front of you, 2 cups are the same beer, 1 cup is different. Can you pick the one that's different? But you used a tetrad test. What's a tetrad test?
Yeah, so a tetrad test is kind of the same concept almost as a triangle test, except instead of 3 samples where 1 is different, you have 4 samples where there are 2 groups of 2, and you're asked to group the samples into 2 groups of 2 based on similarity. So it's getting at the same thing, but just going about it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, in a slightly different way. Why? And why do a tetrad over a triangle, or does it matter? It's just kind of like a different way of doing the same research.
Yeah. So there are advantages of the tetrad. The triangle test is like very widely used, kind of a gold. Well, maybe not gold standard, but it's like kind of the fallback, the standard that everyone uses for discrimination. And it's great when you have a lot of people who are able to participate. So you need a lot more panelists to get the same power from a triangle versus a tetrad test. And it's interesting. And I remember when I was at Oregon State, spent a lot of time digging into like trying to understand statistically how the tetrad is more powerful. Because one thing that you can think about is like, if you have a triangle test, you have 3 samples in front of you. If you were to just guess one of them and not smell any of them, the probability of getting it correct would be 1/3. With the tetrad, it's the same. So it's still, if you chose any 2, the probability of being correct would also be 1/3. But it depends on how you model the interaction between a person and a sample. And so there's kind of a statistical model of how the sensory system works called Thurstonian modeling. And if you use that kind of modeling, you have more power with the tetrad, because that looks at your interaction with it as anytime you smell something or taste something, there's a range of responses. So kind of like there's a distribution of intensity that you will get from tasting any one thing. And so taking that into account, when you're doing the statistics for the tetrad, you actually don't need as many panelists to get the same power. So that's why I use that there, just a little bit more power.
Yeah, a little bit more power with a smaller sample size. All right.
Yeah.
And so then what were the results? I mean, did the beers were they statistically different?
Yeah, so again, like we were really hoping that the bitterness would be exactly the same between them, but they weren't, and it made it kind of obvious which beer was which. We did also dry hop these beers with Cascade to try to kind of cover that up a little bit.
Sure.
So first we did that tetrad test with the dry hop beers. We had 25 panelists, and actually 80% of them were able to get that correct. So that is more than enough for a statistically significant difference between those beers. So there was a difference for the dry hop beers. And then after that, we wanted to kind of backtrack and look at the not dry hop beers and just confirm that the difference that people were seeing there was bitterness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you did that using what we call an alternative forced choice test, right?
Yeah. So this is a more basic test where you really just have 2 samples and you're asked to differentiate them based on which one is more bitter. And again, there we saw that like we expected, the spent hop beer was significantly more bitter.
Yeah, it was significantly more bitter. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Again, you mentioned at the top of the show, like, you do the discrimination testing in this, but chemically we see there's more isoalpha acids in the spent hop beer. So it makes sense that it's going to taste more bitter.
Yeah, and of course there are more nuances than like the intensity of the bitter. Like there's been a ton of research out there on bitterness quality and factors that impact that. Like if you have just isoalpha acid bitterness versus some of those degradation products that you mentioned earlier, you can maybe get a harsher bitterness. We didn't look into that, so that's also a possibility that the bitterness quality was different. I think we were kind of hoping that we were almost in the range. This is kind of a speculation, but I think in general, people can kind of differentiate depending on how good their palate is, like maybe 5 ppm of isoalpha acid. If you're less than that, you might not be able to tell two beers apart. And we were kind of close, being like 19 and 27, but yeah, in the end, it was pretty obvious which was which.
Yeah. So sort of like 8 ppm ISO separate, but like you mentioned, it was pretty obvious which is which. So it may not just be the ISOs. It might be any of the other degradation factors or other characteristics, like you said, the harshness of the bitterness that might have made a difference there, which is pretty interesting. And then the last part of your sensory is you served it to consumers. So how did you test the consumer preferences for this?
Yeah, so we just use the classic 9-point hedonic scale, which goes from a 1 of dislike extremely all the way to 9 of like extremely, with, I guess if you're going up, 2 is dislike very much, dislike moderately, dislike slightly, and then 5 being neutral, like or dislike. And we asked consumers, so we gave them all 4 beers blind coded, so that 4 beers being the pellet hop beer, the spent hopped beer, and then those 2 beers that were also dry hopped. So after the fermentation was complete and we filtered and everything, we dry hopped a portion of it and we left a portion of it. So they got all 4 of those beers, and then they were asked to rate their liking of the aroma of the beer, the bitterness of the beer, and then kind of their overall liking.
Okay. Yeah, nice. So each panelist is asked to rate how they like the aroma, how they like the bitterness, and then overall how much they like the beer on that 9-point scale. So what were the results?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like if you're an industry and you're doing a liking test and you don't see any differences between anything, that's not ideal because you don't really learn anything. But in this case, we did not see any differences for aroma liking, bitterness liking, or overall liking between these beers. And that tells us that at least with the people that we had tasting them, those differences didn't impact how they liked the beer in that sense. So it's kind of it doesn't tell us a ton about characterizing the differences between the beers. What it does tell us is that using this doesn't seem to create an unacceptable product.
Yeah. There's no difference in liking, right? So even though the beers are different and you've shown that they're statistically different from each other, it didn't change whether the consumers liked it or didn't like it, right? So the consumers felt the same about the beer, regardless of whether it was more bitter or less bitter or any of the other, characteristics that may have made those differences between the beers.
Mm-hmm.
That's a cool takeaway, right? Like in this case, you mentioned, right, in the consumer panel or in like industry, if you're testing out a new brand or something and the consumers are like, yeah, it's the same as the other beers, kind of like, well, crap. Okay. Why did we make this new brand? But here, when you're testing out, can we use spent hops as a bittering charge and compare those to like normal hops, and consumers say, yeah, we like both beers? That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I mean, there were some very slight differences, like just in terms of the range that was covered. So like for the pellet hop beer, the liking for bitterness, the highest rating only got up to an 8, whereas someone for all the other beers rated them up to a 9. So
okay,
yeah. super minute differences, but I think it's more of a case of people having different preferences than one of the beers being like, gross, I don't like this is not acceptable.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Yeah. Again, liking is just like, it's all preference based, right? So mm-hmm. Some people may have preferred one beer over the other, but ultimately it all kind of washes, right? So that there were no statistically significant differences in the liking of the beers in those 3 mm-hmm. areas, right? In aroma, bitterness, and overall liking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that's pretty cool. So that all right. So it sounds like from the research, there's a couple of there's some really big takeaways, right? Is one you mentioned at the top of the show is you can make beer, using spent hop material. You can upcycle and reuse spent hop material. There was similar utilization at the lab scale, but then we got higher utilization at the pilot scale. But there's sort of some balancing on this as well too that has to happen. You're going to use a lot more material from the spent hops than you are normal pellet hops because it's just got a lower starting alpha acid concentration, right? It just makes a lot of sense that there's going to be lower alpha acids in your starting material. But then two really cool things, right? Is these beers tasted different. Again, we saw some differences in bitterness, but consumers didn't have a difference in terms of their liking of the beer. So that's pretty cool. Takeaway like that. I would say this is a pretty strong proof of concept that spent hops might be able to be used by breweries if you're looking to upcycle your spent hop waste.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is a little bit after we did this. I know Stan Hieronymus wrote an article in I think Craft Beer Magazine or Craft Beer and Brewing about this. So he does mention this a little bit, but then he also talks much more in depth about some brewers who are actually doing this. So if people are curious about that, definitely check that out. I think it's free online somewhere.
Yeah, cool. That'd be awesome. Maybe we can find it and put it in the show notes, so we'll see. And then listeners, if you're interested in that, just shoot me an email and we'll see if we can get that link to you for where that's at. Well, cool. So I guess you're now at Cornell looking at different research. But is there any interest in coming back and looking at spent hop material or upcycling hop material?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in doing more of it. I kind of started looking at that research when I was at Cornell. So when I was an undergrad here, there was a collaboration with a local brewery here in the chemistry department. And that's where I first had the thought of why are people just getting rid of this material? Can we reuse it? So it definitely would have been interesting to do more with Tom. I think from my perspective, I like that the proof of concept is out there and people can start doing it. I feel like it's hard to draw hard and fast rules about what happens in specific scenarios that can be directly applied to industry from research like this. So yeah, I'm just really glad I got this out there, and then also did the small technical quarterly sustainability assessment to see what might the benefits of upcycling hop material be. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I think my main interest is in sustainability and upcycling, and hops was kind of the lens that I was looking at it there. And I've moved through a couple of different products and product categories. So always excited to be able to continue doing research sort of just in this area.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Dean, if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
Yeah, I think, I guess not to beat a dead horse, but yeah, we've definitely said it a few times, just that this is something that you can do, that's feasible. And I think especially if people are spending a ton of money on more coveted aroma hops and maybe not getting all they can out of them, this could be a potential way to reuse them. There's also been some research, if people want to check out the Upcycled Food Association, that's been a growing organization over the past 2 or 3 years, and they've done, in collaboration with some of the researchers there, they've done some looking at what happens if you make upcycled claims on products. Are consumers more likely to buy them? So I think there's also, beyond getting more out of your hops, I think there is a marketing opportunity as well, because I think most people I know who are concerned about sustainability and climate change want to be able to make decisions and buy things that allow them to exercise their power as a consumer in pushing products that are more sustainable forward. But it's hard to get that message. It's hard to know what decisions you can make that will actually do that. Upcycled Food Association is doing some research on products like that, and they've also shown that if you have upcycled on pack, it might drive purchase intent. So I think there's also opportunities for marketing there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think if it works for your brewery, maybe give it a try and try to dial it in for your system and have a recycled beer, although that maybe isn't such an appealing terminology.
Maybe not that terminology, but who knows? I mean, I can see there certainly be a market out there for it, and this is cool. I mean, again, this research is good proof of concept to show that it's possible to upcycle hops, and that's ultimately a great thing as we figure out sustainability. Now it's up to industry and other researchers to figure out ways to perfect it, to make it more accessible and make it maybe more usable. Was there anything else that we wanted to talk about the study that we didn't get to talk about today, Dean?
No, can't think so. Can't think of any off the top of my head. Yeah.
Well, great then. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I am officially on the hook for the other episode.
All right, so excellent.
Maybe I'll be back. Yeah.
All right, well, good. Well, thanks, Dean. And listeners, in the show notes, you'll find a link to Dean's paper, which is titled Investigating the Potential for Reusing Spent Dry Hops in the Brew Kettle, which was published in Brewing Science in 2019. So be sure to check out all of the things we're up to at brewlosophy.com, and don't forget to listen to our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.